Pleasure to welcome you all to the afternoon session, and this session will be on the sexual body, and I can't think of a better person to begin this section than Wendy Doniger. She is the Mircea Eliade Professor, a Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religion. It's a very appropriate chair for her, since the reader of her dissertation was Eliade himself. And that she has published numerous books, in fact, so many that I was afraid that I wouldn't accurately count them. So it's around 20. She seems to be working now on a memoir and a novel. And what I found, she has 5 honorary degrees, the last one, I believe, from Harvard. What I found most fascinating about her CV was that she trained as a teenager in dance with both George Balanchine and Martha Graham. So I'm sure she will begin to set us all spinning, and she is going to talk about God's body, historical conflicts over the representation of the sexual body of the Hindu god Shiva.
Thank you very much. How did you know that, That's cool.
It's on your beat.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Until February of 2010, the Encyclopedia Britannica entry on Hinduism included this sentence about the Hindu god Shiva. In temples and in private shrines, Shiva is worshipped in the form of the lingam, or phallus, often embedded in the yoni, the symbol of the female sexual organ. That definition was based on the one established by the standard 19th century Sanskrit dictionary of Sir Monier Williams, which defines the lingam, or linga, as the male organ or phallus, especially that of Shiva, worshipped in the form of a stone or marble column, which generally rises out of a yoni, QV, and is set up in temples dedicated to Shiva, end quote. I don't have PowerPoint, but if you've never seen a Shiva lingam, imagine a large thermos. And the yoni would be if it was set on a round plate. That's close enough. But in February 2010, in response to a number of complaints from Hindu readers, Britannica replaced their original sentence with the following rather cumbersome paragraph. In temples and in private shrines, Shiva is worshipped in the form of the lingam, a cylindrical votary object that is often embedded in a yoni or spouted dish. Together, they symbolize the eternal process of creation and regeneration. Since the late 19th century, some scholars have interpreted the lingam and yoni as being aniconic representations of the male and female sexual organs, respectively, period. This change was in response to a dispute about the symbolism of the lingam that has been going on for many centuries. Is its primary meaning inexorably tied up to the physical body, iconic, or is it abstract, aniconic? The Britannica hedged. The lingam is well known throughout India, a signifier that is understood across barriers of caste and language, a lingua franca, if you will. But what is signified? Many Hindus have, like Sigmund Freud, seen lingams in every naturally occurring elongated object, including the so-called self-created lingams, objets trouvés, such as stalagmites. But recently, many Hindus, especially bloggers on the Hindu internet, that I've come to think of as the Hindernet, have insisted that the lingam has nothing at all to do with any part of the body of any human or any god, and the Britannica acted in response to that groundswell, or rather air swell. Where did this argument come from? Today I'll attempt to answer the question about present Hindu sensibilities with a brief consideration of the historical role of 2 non-Hindu states in India, Muslim and British, in the formation of contemporary attitudes to the lingam. The word lingam originally meant any sign, then a sign of gender, then the sign of the male gender, and finally the sign of the male gender of the god Shiva. In the Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic composed about 300 BCE to CE, The word lingam unequivocally designates the sexual organ of Shiva. This text depicts Shiva as a potentially procreative phallus, a fertile lingam, who castrates himself in order to remain a pillar-like renouncer of sexuality, an ascetic lingam. Later, Sanskrit and vernacular texts also depict the Shiva lingam alternatively and in combination as a part of his body and as an abstract symbol of the god, worshipped with offerings of fruit and flowers. The human and divine levels of the lingam were explicitly compared in a Sanskrit text that argued that all creatures in the universe are marked with the signs of the god Shiva and his consort, since all females have yonis, like the base of the lingam, and join with males who have lingams, like the Shiva lingam. The lingam took on a new role in Hinduism during the period of Muslim rule. Many great temples were built at this time, but one large and influential 12th century South Indian Hindu sect differed from earlier renouncers in spurning not only houses but stone temples. These were the Lingayats, the people of the lingam, also called wanderers, because they prided themselves on being moving temples, itinerant, never putting down roots. Their founder preached a simplified devotion, no god but to be united at death with Shiva, and no worship but that of a small lingam worn around the neck. This lingam was never said to have any sexual connotations, but the body of the worshipper himself was the god. Several of the Delhi sultans, devout and iconoclast Muslims, certainly thought that the lingam was sexual and anthropomorphic, and took pride in destroying as many lingams as they could. In 1026, Mahmud of Ghazni attacked the temple of Somnath, which held a famous Shiva lingam. This much at least seems to be historical fact, but then comes the mythologizing. According to some versions of the story, early Turco-Persian triumphalist sources, Mahmud stripped the great gilded lingam of its gold and hacked it to bits with his sword, sending the bits back to Ghazni, where they were incorporated into the steps of the new mosque. Medieval Hindu epics of resistance created a counter-mythology in which the stolen image came to life, another bit of evidence that it was regarded as a living thing, and eventually, like a horse trotting back to the stable, returned to the temple to be reconsecrated. In South India, 250 years later, Alauddin's forces attacked the temple of the dancing Shiva in Chidambaram, and the kick of the horse of Islam, as one Indo-Persian poet put it, destroyed the lingams there. The 17th century Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb particularly hated Varanasi, Benares, because it was the center of lingam worship, which he regarded as the most abominable of all abominations. British historiographers made much of the destruction of Hindu temples and lingams by the Muslims in order to claim that the British had rescued the Hindus from oppression by Muslims. But the British missionaries themselves despised what they regarded as the obscene idolatry of the lingam. Victorian British attitudes to Hindu eroticism ricocheted between the pornographers and the prudes, and Sir Richard Burton was certainly no prude. A connoisseur of eroticism in Arabic as well as Indian culture, he published the first English translation of the Kama Sutra, the textbook of erotic love, in 1883, a time when the Hindus, cowering under the scorn of the Protestant proselytizers, wanted to sweep it under the Upanishadic rug. The San Francisco Chronicle suggested that the publication of Burton's Kama Sutra translation, quote, might act as a useful corrective to the prevailing cliché of India as a land of asceticism, end quote. But Burton and his co-translator, Freddie Arbuthnot, known as Bunny, adroitly managed to escape the smell of obscenity by using what they presented as the Hindu terms for the sexual organs, yoni and lingam, throughout their translation of the Kama Sutra. English, unlike Sanskrit, lacks any register for the sexual organs between the obscene and the medical, to the extent that 19th century writers regarded the words themselves, not the actual things that they designated, as obscene. The foreign words, Sanskrit words, lingam and yoni, devoid of any English connotations at all, were able to make an end run around the obscene thought, not to mention the obscenity laws. The term lingam was perceived as neither erudite nor earthy, neither gross nor gynecological. Burton's co-translator Arbuthnot elsewhere even attempted to coin the word yonic to match phallic. But this decision of Burton's to use lingam and yoni to represent the sexual organs in the Kama Sutra was problematic in several ways. First of all, these terms do not represent the text, which rarely uses the word lingam, and then not to refer to the sexual organ of the male alone, but to both. Instead, the Sanskrit Kama Sutra uses several different words, primarily a gender-neutral term, which could be translated as pelvis or between the legs, or other terms that are neither coy nor vulgar. So for Burton to use the terms lingam and yoni to translate, as it were, other Sanskrit words for the sexual organs was to create a weird linguistic backformation. Second objection is that by Burton's time, the terms lingam and yoni had taken on strong religious overtones, as both Indian English and Indian vernacular languages used them primarily to designate the stone icons of the god Shiva and his consort. The exclusive application of these two terms to human genitals, therefore, may have had at the very least inappropriate overtones and at the most blasphemous implications for some Hindus. Yet Burton and Arbuthnot knew the religious meaning of the lingam. Arbuthnot observed that there is in Hindustan an emblem of great sanctity, which is known as the linga yoni. Finally, the terms lingam and yoni had Orientalist implications for most English readers. The use of any Sanskrit term at all in place of an English equivalent anthropologized sex, distanced it, made it safe for English readers by assuring them, or pretending to assure them, that the text was not about real sexual organs, their sexual organs, but merely about the appendages of weird, dark-skinned people far away. This move dodged the smell of obscenity through the same logic that allowed National Geographic to depict the bare breasts of black African women long before it became respectable to show white women's breasts in Playboy. Indeed, in some instances, National Geographic actually darkened the skin color of a partially naked Polynesian woman in order to render her nudity more acceptable to American audiences. The use of the term lingam enabled the authors to pretend that the book was not obscene because it was about India, when they really thought it was about sex and knew that English readers would think so too. And so Sir Richard Burton is the one who really made lingam in English into a dirty word. No wonder that the Hindus recoiled from that implication. One begins to see why some Hindus began to be very sensitive about the interpretation of the word lingam, the Kama Sutra, and the entire erotic tradition of Hinduism. The history of the word lingam and the history of the shift in its contexts demonstrates that we are dealing not just with two bodies of separate texts, one interpreting the lingam sexually and one theologically, but with a tension within each of a number of texts. But nowadays, many Hindu texts treat the lingam as an aniconic pillar of light or an abstract symbol of God with no sexual reference. There is nothing surprising about this. By the late 19th century, for many Hindus, a Hindu lingam was no more a penis than a cross was a Roman instrument of execution for a Christian. Bunny Arbuthnot actually wrote a book about what he called the masculine cross, that is, the Shiva lingam. The Sanskrit text that argued that all human beings are born with the signs of Shiva and Parvati on their bodies implies that they are born with the symbol of their faith, as a Christian might be born with a birthmark in the shape of a cross, or might receive the mark of the stigmata on her palms. To continue this parallel, some Christians see in the cross a vivid reminder of the agony on Calvary, while others see it as a symbol of their God in the abstract, or of Christianity as a religion. But some Hindus who see the lingam as an abstract symbol object to and attempt to censure the interpretations of those who view it in more somatic terms. They would be the counterparts of Christians who would refuse to acknowledge that the cross ever referred to the crucifixion of the historical Jesus. These are the people in India, but also increasingly in the American diaspora, who advocate a sanitized spiritual form of Hinduism, and in India, a nationalist and anti-Muslim form. There's nothing new in the tension between abstract and earthy interpretations of the lingam in India. What is new is the insistence that one of them, the earthy one, is wrong and must be silenced. To conclude, by returning to the beginning, let us recall that the word lingam primarily means a sign. And signs are always reversible. Like myths, symbols change all the time. The greatest of all the survival tactics of a great symbol is its ability to stand on its head. This flexibility allows a symbol to be shared by a group who, as individuals, have various points of view, and to survive through time, through different generations with different points of view. This is certainly true of the lingam. In order to include the full range of its meanings in our understanding of it, it might be best either to leave the term lingam untranslated, unglossed, like dharma, which is now an English word, or to settle for the broadest possible meaning, perhaps just a symbol of the god Shiva. To paraphrase a line often wrongly attributed to Sigmund Freud, sometimes a lingam is just a lingam. But more often it is both a lingam and a cigar. We need to be aware of both the literal and symbolic levels of the lingam, the historical and the contemporary meaning simultaneously. The history of interpretations of the lingam in India reveal the ways that the actions of the state, in this case the presence of foreign powers, Muslim and British, who viewed the lingam negatively, deeply affect native perceptions of the body of their own god. The British presence in particular also had a negative effect on the self-perception that Hindus had of their own bodies. The British regarded the Hindus, like most colonized people of color, as simultaneously oversexed and impotent. Many highly placed Hindus so admired their colonizers that in a kind of colonial and religious Stockholm syndrome, they swallowed the Protestant missionary line themselves and became ashamed of the erotic sculptures on their temples, their temple dancers, the more sensual aspects of their own religious literature, and the sexual meanings of the lingam. Thank you.
Moving quickly on. Our next speaker is Sharon Marcus. She's the Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She's written several books, including City and Home in 19th Century Paris and London, and Between Women, I think I wrote Friendship, Desire, and Marriage. She's written numerous articles, won quite a few awards for both her books and her scholarship more generally. And today she's going to speak about, quite intriguingly, does sexuality exist without the state?
Thank you. At a conference on the body and the state and a panel on the sex body, it is good to remember that both the state and sexuality have a history. I'm going to use the example of Victorian England, which has had an exemplary status in scholarship on the state and on the sex body, to highlight how that history matters, to demonstrate the variability of law and government with respect to the body. One of the questions we were asked to address, most broadly for the whole conference, was how does the state protect and regulate the body? I'll provide some answers to that, but I'd also like to highlight what I consider an even more important question for liberal states. How is sexuality also the result of the state's decisions not to regulate certain acts and not to protect particular bodies? I'll begin this talk with a point about discourse, reminding us how recent our use of the word sexuality is. I'll then provide a brief overview of changes within the 19th century British state and how those changes played out in terms of sexed and gendered bodies. And in the final part of the talk, I will suggest that the very concept of sexuality implies a debate about state control, that sexuality, as we have come to use the term, cannot exist outside the framework of the state. The state creates sexuality by designating desires and acts it cannot or should not control, and desires and acts it must constrain or eliminate. I'll conclude by suggesting that because sexuality is so tied to the state, to the law, and to institutions, we neglect important aspects of the human experience of love, desire, and physical sensation by focusing too closely on sexuality. What might a history of forms of intimacy to which the state is utterly indifferent look like? First part. So to take sexuality or the sexed body as a rubric for understanding Victorian England is actually a bit odd, since few words better illustrate the gulf between how the Victorians saw themselves and how we see them than variants on the word sex. To have sex was not a common locution until the early 20th century, and it was only in the 20th century's final decades that feminist and queer theorists began to insist on distinctions among sexuality, sex, and gender. Sexuality now denotes a complex of desires, affects, sensations, identifications, and acts. Sex, the biological characteristics that identify individuals as male and female, though those physical differences increasingly seem culturally constructed and physically manipulable. And gender refers to an individual's sense of identity as masculine or feminine, as well as to social demarcations of masculine and feminine qualities and roles. Now, in the 19th century, to be sexual meant primarily to be sexed male or female, even though in the 20th century, sexuality became shorthand for sexual orientation. And though two Victorian men, Havelock Ellis and John Simmons, helped initiate that change in usage, even they thought of the sexual in Victorian terms as referring primarily to male or female sex. Thus, when Ellis and Simmons coined the phrase sexual inversion in the 1890s, they used it to label men who felt like women and women who felt like men. Your sex was inverted. Not men who desired men and women who desired women, although they also saw those categories as intimately connected in ways we no longer do. Before the 1890s, sexuality was a biological term whose primary meaning indicated a type of reproduction in plants and animals. For most of the Victorian period, sex meant gender, not the act of sexual intercourse. Women are the fair sex in Dickens's novel The Pickwick Papers, men the sterner sex in Charlotte Bronte's novel Shirley. Sex was not something one did, it described who one was. Sex served as a principle of classification that defined individuals and conferred collective identity. Each person had a sex and belonged to one. The word thus often appears in Victorian literature modified by a possessive pronoun. Elizabeth Gaskell in one novel writes of a woman who can charm not only men but also her own sex. Miss Betsy Trotwood in David Copperfield is the best of her sex. To have a sex was both to embody certain qualities as an individual person and to merge with a group. Women, routinely seen as less individualized than men, were thus often called the sex. This very brief, all too brief linguistic history suggests that we cannot do the history of what we now think of as the sexual body or sexuality by looking for words like sex and sexuality in the writings of the past. So the question is then, did the Victorians share our concepts but simply give them another name, or did they have different concepts? And for today in particular, how did the state define what we now call sexuality? What practices did it prohibit? What practices did it protect? What practices did it ignore? Another all too truncated history of the British state is needed to understand something about its relation to the sexual body. By the 19th century, British political thought and culture had developed a strong belief in negative liberty and privacy. Liberalism, their particular version of that word, argued the importance of letting market forces rather than government regulation decide many matters, and insisted on the importance of limiting the power of rulers over individuals. At the same time, utilitarians and reformers of many ilks sought to turn the state into an instrument of social adjustment and improvement, and to rationalize the principles and workings of the state and of a very complicated legal system that combined three systems: common law, civil law, and ecclesiastical law. The 19th century in England was therefore a period of conflict around the state with no clear sense of what its jurisdiction or structure should be. The 19th century was also a period in which old laws and customs collided with extremely new ones. Like most European countries, England had a long history of criminalizing sodomy under ecclesiastical law as reformed by Henry VIII in 1533 at an earlier moment of state consolidation. Over the course of the 19th century, sodomy went from being a capital crime defined by very old laws, religious laws, to being redefined as gross indecency by a very new law, the Amendment to the Criminal Offences Act in 1885. The 19th century was also a moment of collision between old and new laws concerning women as wives and mothers. At the beginning of the century, married adult women had no legal identity apart from their husbands. They could not own property, were not liable for debt, had no right to any earnings, could file for divorce only under very limited conditions, more restricted than those for men, and had no right to custody in their children. And feminists challenged those laws throughout the century, producing some minor adjustments to them throughout the decades. As we saw in our brief philological survey, the Victorians understood sex to refer primarily to the difference between male and female. And one could argue that the need to differentiate between men and women, and more specifically to subordinate women to men, was fundamental to the Victorian understanding of many things that we now group under the heading sexuality: gender identity, genital contact, biological reproduction, kinship. In other words, sexuality for the Victorians was a way to police the border between men and women, masculinity and femininity, and to unequally distribute the resources of state and society between those two categories. Men whose behavior did not conform to the definition of a man as one who has sex with women were the object of severe legal penalties if their behavior became widely known. Even after legal reform, roughly mid-century, undid sodomy as a capital crime, it produced the much vaguer notion of gross indecency between men as punishable by imprisonment, whether conducted in public or private. The police arrested men and women for cross-dressing, and but there's a famous case, but I'm going to I'll mention it and then not go into detail about it. The case of Bolton and Park in 1870, arrested for dressing as women, arrested for conspiracy to commit sodomy because they dressed as women in public. The enforcement of gender roles also goes far to explain the many interesting and overlooked ways in which the Victorian state refused to control the sexual body or made it the subject of legislation only after great controversy. Marital rape and adoption had no legal existence whatsoever because the rights of husbands and fathers to protection from state interference were so strong. Prostitution, sex between adult men and female minors were also very vexed areas of regulation. It took enormous effort to make it possible in the 1870s for working women who could not afford legal fees to have violent husbands arrested. Laws that protected very young women from rape or working women from being battered could usually only be passed through the use of melodramatic appeals that cast women as weak victims in need of protection and thus rhetorically reinforced conventional gender boundaries. Sexuality as gender distinction was also a way to maintain the border between colonizer and colonized, West and East. Thus, debates about divorce throughout the period often hinged on a contrast between Christian monogamy and Eastern polygamy. Those against making divorce easier to obtain praised permanent Christian marriage as the union of two equal souls and argued that readily available divorce would turn British marriage into polygamy, which since at least the 18th century, British thinkers had associated with female subjugation. Changing the marriage laws of non-Western countries in the name of protecting women became a common way for British agents of empire to present imperial conquest and exploitation as protection of the weak against the despotic. Thus, we see in Victorian England the state defining sexuality through control of the gendered body, for example, by criminalizing sex between men, through protection of the gendered body, defending weak women against predatory men, by designating certain gendered bodies, relations, and acts as simply beyond its control: paternal rights in offspring, husbands' rights to sexual intercourse at will with wives, and by refusing to recognize certain bodies, relations, and acts as even existing, for example, sex between men, which was not a crime. The 19th century saw a major expansion and redefinition of the state apparatus in England, which produced debates about what were appropriate objects of state control. Although Foucault argued that the most powerful forms of sexuality in the 19th century were extra-governmental and worked through norms, institutions, and incitement, rather than through outright state repression and prohibitions, the state did not take a strictly prohibitive role. As Chris Otter has recently shown, the state played an active role in creating the very liberal individual conceived as exceeding state control. And the state was deeply involved in the creation of norms and deviations, since it decided what it would criminalize, legalize, and ignore, and therefore which forms of sexuality to prohibit, permit, or let exist. Indeed, one might say that from the point of view of the state, norms were those forms of sexuality which it failed or refused to regulate, which it designated as outside its purview. In conclusion, I'd like to suggest that we extend Foucault's idea that the very concept of sexuality is a form of control to the state that he was so eager to displace as the central locus of the definition of sexuality. As with 19th century discourses such as sexology, the 19th century state posited sexuality as a question of control, as a force to be constrained or let loose, repressed or liberated, a force that left to its own devices can harm others or oneself, or whose repression can harm others or oneself. And that in some cases has rights or powers so strong that they would render any state intervention illegitimate. If the very concept of sexuality is inseparable from the state's power to control or not control it, then one way the state controls the body is through this very concept. Now, since sexuality may itself be inseparable from a problematic of control in general and state control in particular, the final question is, what can we see if we stop using sexuality as a lens? And I'm going to do this by looking very briefly at a range of social relations almost completely ignored by the Victorian state and Victorian law, still relatively untouched by legal controls today, and that we don't always think of as falling under the rubric of sexuality, and these are relations between women. In turning to relations between women, I'm also arguing that we should consider expanding our attention beyond the sexual body to what I will call the erotic self. By the erotic self, I mean a self constituted by fantasy, by desire, but also by heightened emotion and strong physical, but not necessarily what we would call sexual sensations, by attachments and relationships defined variously by obsession, domination, altruism, reciprocity, or unrequitedness, self-sacrifice, memory, nostalgia, legal interdependence, distance, or intimacy. The acts and desires that we call sexual, usually to suggest that they involve physical contact between orifices and sexual organs or feelings of sexual arousal leading to orgasm, can certainly be part of the erotic self. But the sexual body is not always in close communication with the erotic self, and selves in relationships can be deeply erotic without involving the sexual at all. In Victorian England, there were many instances of sexual relationships between women who often used the unusual rights to property and wages that they had as technically unmarried women to cobble together with one another legal approximations of marriage. These women used wills, property deeds, church rights, burial practices, even alimony payments to create quasi-marital arrangements that had legal and social standing, despite the fact that they were never legally recognized as marriages. So in this case, we have an example of the state ignoring sexual relationships between women, probably because there were too few of them to raise alarm. Interestingly, female marriage also seems to be an example of the state failing to regulate acts that defied the border between male and female, since a woman marrying another woman involved her assuming what were perceived as male sexual prerogatives. Here, however, the concept of the erotic self undefined by state control is helpful. The occasional marital arrangement between women, rarely kept secret, was not an occasion for state control or protection, or even for much social opprobrium, because it so closely resembled the erotic relationships that were considered part of the normative definition of Victorian femininity. Intense, lifelong, powerful, fervent, emotionally intense, and physically intimate friendships between women were seen as not merely an acceptable but a required feature of femininity, one that promoted many of the stereotypical traits associated with what the Victorians called true womanhood: sentiment, self-sacrifice, sociability, leisure, a delight in giving and receiving physical attentions and affections that were not seen as necessarily leading to sexual acts and could not produce offspring. I have 3 more sentences. Friendship between women was not seen as a threat to marriage, but as promoting it. In many Victorian novels dominated by courtship plots, a close female friendship or a connection between women helps to bring about the marital conclusion. It would be a mistake, I think, an empirical, conceptual, and political mistake to translate these kinds of erotic relations into sexuality. Instead, I offer these friendships as an historical example of how norms enable as much as they stifle, and how the erotic self has never been fully defined by the state's control, protection, or recognition. Instead, the erotic self has often flourished in the shade of the state's utter neglect. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Afshana Najmanbadi, who is the Francis Lee, I have to get the chair right, Francis Lee Higginson Professor of History and of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University. She has published several books. A recent one was entitled Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, Gender and Sexual Attitudes of Iranian Modernity. She's a specialist on issues of gender and sexuality in Iran, and it's my pleasure to introduce her. And she will be talking about verdicts of science, rulings of faith, transgender, sexuality in contemporary Iran. Thanks.
Thank you. On January 6, 2010, the Director General of the Office for the Socially Harmed at the Welfare Organization of Iran announced that the code under which transsexuals would now receive exemption from the required military service had been changed from mental disorders to glandular disorders. On the face of it, one could read this announcement as one more step taken by the Iranian government to rearrange the subject population within a pathologizing taxonomy. And indeed, it is that too. In the current narratives about transsexuality in Iran, all too often, contemporary procedures that have emerged in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution are largely attributed to the Islamic State's policy of homicidal homophobia. What I hope to bring out in my alternative account is the supplemental work of transactivism. Similar to other domains and forms of engagement with governmental institutions, transactivism, far from being a state-driven and controlled project that at most has produced some policy benefits for transsexuals, is part of the process of state formation itself, an ongoing process that over 3 decades later continues to shape and reshape, fracture and refracture, order and reorder what we name the state. At their best, readings of transsexuality in Iran as legal and on the rise because of impossibility of homosexuality, or even more severely, as a governmental sanctioned project with the aim of eliminating homosexuality, work with a reductive Foucauldian concept of the techniques of domination, in which subjectivity is constituted by governmental designs and hegemonic power. While I hope to remain cognizant of and indeed map out some of these techniques in contemporary Iran, in my work I lean towards highlighting how such techniques become at once productive and transported into the art of existence. Indeed, their work of domination depends on their productivity for the art of existence. I was lucky to be in Iran for this research in a period when much about transsexual lives and laws were shaping and reshaping on an almost daily level. As Soto has observed, the coherence of the practices that Foucault selected and examined was, I quote, the result of a particular success beneath what one might call the monotheistic privilege that panoptic apparatuses have won for themselves. A polytheism of scattered practices survives, dominated but not erased by the triumphal success of one of their numbers. I aim to capture the polytheistic scattered practices that were a critical element in shaping trans lives and subjectivities in Iran, to map out a situated cartography of desire that locates the contemporary discourses and practices of transsexuality at a historicized nexus of medicine, religious doctrine, psychology, criminology, the family, transactivism, and trans practices of everyday life. What transsexuality as a humankind, to use Ian Hacking's concept, means today in Iran is specific to a nexus formed not simply by transnational diffusions of concepts and practices from a Western hinterland to the rest. It is as well the product of sociocultural and political situation in Iran over the previous half a century. Today, living a transsexual life in Iran carries a particular set of affiliations and disaffiliations that are specific to this national-transnational nexus. The distinction between the acceptable transsexual from the deviant homosexual, for instance, has been enabled by biomedical, psychological, legal, and Islamic jurisprudential discourses that were formed between the 1970s and between the 1940s and the 1970s, before the Islamic Revolution, when surgical transformations of transsexual bodies initially emerged as a variant of a larger category of sex change scientific marvels, referring largely in the first place to intersex bodily transformations. In the discourse of the national scientific progress of the 1930s and 40s, trans bodies emerged as affiliated with and yet distinct from congenital intersex bodies, and sex change medical interventions were discussed as examples of advancements in medicine and surgery. The discourse of the marvelous within vernacular science worked with the emerging psychobehavioral sciences discourse of sexuality that was not concerned with the exceptional. Rather, the latter incorporated all bodies in its concern with the health of the nation, the progress of its educational system, and the reform of family norms. A growing academization of vernacular psychology and sexology of these earlier decades resulted in the dominance of psychosexology within the medical and health scientific community by the late 1960s. This dominance proved critical in shifting this transsexual from its affiliation with the intersect to a family resemblance with homosexuality. The history of modern stigmatization of homosexuality is thus a crucial part of the analysis. The 1979 revolution and consolidation of an Islamic republic produced a paradoxical situation for transsexuality. On the one hand, it immediately made what we would name and recognize as transgendered lives impossibly hazardous, while on the other, it led to its official sanction. In the 1970s, women presenting males, and I'm translating a Persian into an awkward English here, had carved themselves a space of relative acceptance in particular sites and professions. The 1979 revolution, and in particular the cultural purification campaigns of the first few years, ruptured the dynamic of acceptability and marginalization of the vulgar and the deviant accorded to women presenting males by the larger society. Now, they not only carried the stigma of male homosexuality, but they also transgressed the newly imposed regulations of gendered dressing in public. Simultaneously, the establishment of an Islamic republic set in motion a process of bureaucratization, professionalization, and specialization of Islamic jurisprudence, and the Islamization of the state that has made the current transition process possible. At present, the transition process works around the notion of filtering, a 4 to 6 month period of psychotherapy along with hormonal and chromosomal tests, the stated goal of which is to determine if an applicant is really transsexual, really homosexual, intersex, or perhaps suffers from a series of other classificatory disorders. A commission at the Tehran Psychiatry Institute, affiliated with the Medical University of Tehran, makes a diagnostic recommendation at the end of this 4 to 6 month period to the Legal Medicine Organization of Iran, whose board of specialists makes a final decision and issues, if approved, the much hoped for official certification of one's status as transsexual. This much sought after certification is the legal document that opens numerous doors for transsexuals. Not only does the certificate authorizes the permissibility of hormonal treatment and sex reassignment surgery, it also entitles one to basic health insurance, state-provided, financial assistance for partial cost of surgeries, and for housing aid and military service exemption. The Legal Medical Organization also instructs a special court to approve the name change of the certified person post-SRS, which entitles the person to receive new national identification papers. This filtering process, so-called, has been enabled by the contingent convergence of political religious authority with the scientific authority of medical professions. This convergence has itself been dependent on two related processes. Islamic jurisprudence has become highly specialized and acquired a disciplinary shape, while modern state rationalization has taken form through the project of compliance, in particular compliance of medicine, including psychiatry and psychology, with Islam. Significantly, however, the possibility of consolidation of status of transsexuality through the workings of the compliance project was actualized in great part through the work of transsexuals. After several years of lobbying in 1987, the Legal Medical Office sent a query to the Legal Office of Ministry of Justice asking for clarification on the legality of sex reassignment surgeries. The ministry's response, based completely on various sections of Ayatollah Khomeini's compendium of rulings, stated that sex surgeries were legal, whether on the intersex or on transsexuals. Over the next decades, the development of detailed legal and medical procedures on transsexuality became a celebrated showcase of achievement of compliance of medical and legal concepts and practices with Islam. When it comes to sex change, as it is with many other issues, there is no unanimity of opinion among Shia scholars in Iran. But regardless of these differing stances, it was the overwhelming weight of Ayatollah Khomeini's own ruling that translated into law. This weight cannot be understood as a matter of religious authority. It was an authority derived from his unique position as leader of the most massive revolution in the late 20th century. Khomeini's ruling appears under a section on examination of contemporary questions, within which a subsection is devoted to changing of sex. It reads, and I read it in part, the prima facie view is contrary to prohibiting the changing by operation of a man's sex to that of a woman or vice versa. Likewise, the operation, in case of hermaphrodites, is not prohibited in order that she or he may become incorporated into one of the two sexes. Does this sex change operation become obligatory if a woman perceives in herself the inclinations which are among the type of inclinations of a man? Or some qualities of masculinity, or if a man perceives in himself inclinations of a woman? The prima facie view is that sex change is not obligatory if a person is truly of one sex, and changing his or her sex to the opposite sex is possible. The double negative in the first sentence, contrary to prohibiting, and the concluding not obligatory, are the critical terms that have defined the legal procedures for sex reassignment. From the point of view of transsexuals, this conceptualization has opened up the space for acquiring the certificate of transsexuality without being required to go through any hormonal or somatic changes if they did not wish to. Even a brief review of responder literature shows the complexity of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, as a source of authoritative judgment, both generally and in relation to transsexuals. The designation of male and female in classical Islamic jurisprudence is distinctly related to observance of subject-dependent rules. These distinctions are not identical to and do not perform the same work as biological sex taxonomies. For instance, a person of ambiguous genitalia can become assigned a ritual gender sex so that she or he would follow the rules of one gender or sex. In contemporary discussions, the fiqhi notion of jins travels between two distinct registers: the classical Islamic meaning of jins as genus of something, and the notion of sex in the modern sense. The transformation of sociocultural notions of sex gender over the past century has brought into proximity the male-female distinction of Islamic jurisprudence with the biological sex taxonomies and social categories of men and women. This proximity has enabled the convergence of some Islamic jurisprudential thinking with the biomedical and psychosexuological discourse about transsexuality. But Shia scholars are also trained to keep these category distinctions apart, and this is actually very critical, but I won't get into it. A jurisprudential challenge vis-a-vis the subject of transsexuality, however, arises when the subject is in transition. How does one deal with the so-called discordant subject, as they're referred to, with the lack of correspondence between sex and sex, gender of the body and soul, as it's often referred to in that literature? Does one go by the sex of the body or the sex of the soul? Here, transsexuals insist on going by the soul. Trans-friendly scholars, such as Harriman, who's on several documentaries, they are worried about the intrusion of homosexual practices that haunt Islamic jurisprudential thinking on this subject, and thus lean on going by the sex of the body. Okay, I'm going to fix this. The complicated implication of considerations of state and requirement of religion provides a negotiating and resisting spaces for transsexuals and allows a domain of murkiness for living non-heteronormative lives. As one F2M put it, once I was diagnosed as trans, I started having sex with my girlfriend without feeling sinful. I would like to conclude with some reflections on challenges of translation. I started this research with what seemed to be two simple questions, coherent do I need to finish? First, in a legal cultural context where same-sex desire was considered shameful and same-sex practices were illegal, but within which transsexuality, even if overwhelmingly understood as shameful, was nevertheless legal and state subsidized, how did this configuration shape sexual and gender subjectivities? Relatedly, how did insistent state regulations and religio-cultural codes and rituals concerning proper gender conduct shape sexual desires and gender subjectivities? Both questions were in important ways informed by the distinction between gender, sex, sexuality that had shaped my thinking over the previous 3 decades of teaching, research, and activism in the US. Very quickly, it became clear that many of the stories I heard and lives I became part of seemed incoherent, if not incomprehensible, were I to make them responsible for answering these questions. When it comes to issues of gender and sexual identification and desire and practices, a single concept linguistically and culturally has kept them together. And indeed, lives have become possible through the lack of emerging distinctions between these categories. As importantly, some of the conceptual distinctions between gender, sex, and sexuality within Anglo-American context, including the distinction sometimes made between transgender and transsexual, have been shaped over the past decades by the identity politics of gender and sexuality, as well as by queer activism and critical theory. Transsexuality in Iran has not been shaped by such developments. Given the different political and sociocultural context, to what extent were analytical categories and theoretical distinctions developed in this recent setting? here useful for understanding what I was observing in Iran. How did seemingly similar assignations mean differently or not within a different politics of sex, sexuality, and gender? What happens when words leave one setting and become enfolded into another? The issue of change of concepts and traveling from one history and context to another does not pertain just to words. The current procedures of diagnosis, treatment for subjects under domain of psychiatry, psychology, including transsexuals in Iran, are based on DSM-3 and 4 and a number of US designated tests. The dominance of American scientific discourses, training, and procedures has transported many of these concepts globally. Because of their status as science, they arrive at their destination as dislocated, as if with no history of origin. Their re-embedding in the local context at the particular historical moment of the past 2 decades in Iran, for instance, has transformed their meaning and produced specific effects in that acquired location. When thinking about imported categories and practices, my focus is not to trace the origin of the import. Rather, I'm interested in what the borrowing, appropriation, and embracing means for the importers, so to speak. What work does the import do in its local context in relation to the many other concepts and practices that it becomes intertwined with and that informs its meaning in the transplanted place? What are the implications of recognizing these differential situated meanings of words for building alliances internationally on issues of sexual rights?
Thank you. We're going to keep with a similar theme on transgendered rights, and our next speaker is Paisley Curran. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. He is best known for a co-edited volume he had on transgendered rights, but he's also an individual who moves from the academic to the political, in the sense that he is a founding board member of Transgender Law and Policy Institute. He is also on the board of directors of Global Advocates for Trans Equality, and he is on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgendered Rights Program, as well as many other committees. And so he will speak today on securing gender, state, bodies, and identity verification.
I just want to start off by saying that I have a co-author for this paper whose name is Tara McQueen. She can't be here, and I want to say that anything that I say today that doesn't make sense is solely my responsibility and not hers. So, we've responded to the enormity of the topic of gender, the body, and the state by coming up with a frighteningly narrow question. What happens at the airport when U.S. Transportation Security Administration agents perceive a conflict between the gender read on one's body through a scanner, the gender marked on one's papers, or an individual's gender presentation? This conflict might and has indeed created inconvenient, uncomfortable, even distressing obstacles for some travelers. But the possibility of it happening is of concern to only a very small segment of the population. So we don't believe that thinking through this particular event will help us come up with some all-encompassing molar narrative that accounts for all the different ways that state actors produce or police particular gender arrangements. We do think, though, that in an historical moment in which both technologies and expanded police powers have greatly intensified the securitization of identity, looking at the collision between these large transactional realities of gender, the state, and the body, in this one particular moment might tell us something about what happens when the apparently unremarkable practices of state identity management rub up against the heightened scrutiny of bodies in the war on terror. This sort of analysis could be carried out in relation to any number of unruly identities, but we're focusing here on what the state expects gender to do for it. And a note of my terminology, I really at this point in my life don't really understand or can make a distinction between sex and gender. And in my research on the state and gender, it doesn't really matter. Gender or sex is what the state says it is. So I'm using gender for the purpose of this talk just to fit in with the conference theme. So I'm going to talk about two TSA policies that have created, or at least intensified, the problem faced by transgender travelers. We are far from working through all the implications of this, but I'll throw out some ideas in the conclusion and look forward to your comments and ideas. Begun in 2009, the TSA's Secure Flight Program requires consumers to provide the airline with their name, their date of birth, and their gender exactly as they appear on government-issued identity cards when they book their flight. The airlines will then transmit that information to the TSA. Before allowing a boarding pass to be issued, the TSA will run that data against its no-fly lists. The rationale for the program, according to the TSA, is that by providing more discrete points of reference, passengers can significantly decrease the likelihood of watch list misidentification. When the Department of Homeland Security published these proposed changes in the Federal Register and asked for comments, one person or organization wrote in to suggest that the TSA should eliminate the gender requirement altogether and instead require passengers to submit information regarding their ethnicity, race, or national origin. The TSA declined that advice. In fact, the TSA responded in the Federal Register by pointing out that many names are not gender neutral. Additionally, names not derived from the Latin alphabet, when translated into English, do not generally denote gender. Providing information on gender will reduce the number of false positive watch list matches because the information will distinguish persons who have the same or similar name. So the individual who submitted this testimony was just saying you don't need to count people's gender, and it's obviously odd and a little bit suspect that the individual thought that race or ethnicity was a better piece of data. But what's interesting is that the TSA didn't even consider the possibility of eliminating gender. Instead, it responded that because one couldn't always deduce gender from a name, it would have to be explicitly communicated to the airline. Gender has been so long recognized as a biometric identifier of the first order that it structures common sense thinking about identity verification. In the U.S., an individual's gender marker as M or F is included on almost all state issued identity documents or in the records associated with the document. It's especially important on documents that bureaucrats at departments of vital statistics informally refer to as breeder documents, such as passports and birth certificates. Here's the problem, however, that Secure Flight poses for many transgender people. Secure Flight assumes that the gender marker on the piece of ID is not troublesome, is not contested, that it's going to help certify identity rather than add to the confusion and make it harder to sort out who you are. But for transgender folks, sometimes, the gender marker on a piece of state-issued ID might contradict in their own presentation of their gender through affect, clothes, makeup, grooming, voice, and other cultural insignia of gender. For example, someone presenting as female might, unlike other women, have an M on her passport, or someone who looks like a man might show his driver's license with a gender marker of F. An anomaly occurs in the mismatch between the legal gender marker and the individual's gender presentation. And at the airport, in this move from kind of security based on probability to security based on possibility, an anomaly is an event, and that event automatically triggers higher levels of scrutiny. So rather than ending a situation of uncertainty there, then, in this situation, confusion erupts. And while the intensity and application of scrutiny is new, the problem itself is not. The lack of correlation between bodies and identity documents has long posed an obstacle for those whose gender identity doesn't correspond to the social expectations for the sex assigned to them at birth. So here's what this problem can look like in practice. In 1994, a transgender woman in Idaho was arrested for the crime of false personation. When the police knocked on her door, they came to her door, they were looking for her husband who was cutting checks. But in the course of investigating her, they were going through all the couple's documents. The officer looked over her papers and saw a contradiction between her driver's license, which identified her as Henry and male, and her marriage certificate, which identified her as Henrietta. And that led to her arrest for the crime of marriage under false personation, described in the arrest warrant as an assault against the peace and dignity of the state of Idaho. So, very big business there. More often, however, a disjunction between gender identity and identification is not targeted as a crime in itself, but becomes the vehicle for taking away rights and privileges distributed based on gender. Marriages are declared invalid, wills are voided, parental relationships are permanently severed, jobs are lost, trans prisoners are segregated with the wrong gender in correctional facilities. When an individual's cultural legibility is not affirmed by their identity papers, even everyday quotidian transactions become moments of vulnerability. As one woman testifying before a New York City Council hearing put it, "I do not suffer from gender dysphoria. I suffer from bureaucratic dysphoria. My ID does not match my appearance. I worry every time I apply for a job, every time I authorize a credit card check, every time I buy a plane ticket." So as a result of secure flight, travelers whose gender marker on their identity document does not reflect their gender presentation risk facing intensified scrutiny, outing, even denial of travel. In response, the National Center for Transgender Equality tells its constituents in a widely circulated Know Your Rights flyer that they have the right to travel in any gender they want. But, the flyer points out, the TSA suggests that transgender travelers carry a letter from their doctor. In the article that comes out of this paper, we'll talk about the various regulatory apparatuses put in place to verify identity, the way that data is aggregated, circulated, disaggregated, and we'll think through how expectations of gender certainty matter for what Mariana Valverde has called targeted governance's quest for perfect information. We'll also talk about the many layers of mediating filters between states and bodies when it comes to gender classification. But for the purpose of this talk, we want to spend a little more time laying out the problem at the airport in more detail, and that leads me to the second policy. In 2010, the situation faced by transgender travelers was made even worse when the TSA began using advanced imaging technologies at airports in the U.S. With the new millimeter wave and backscatter imaging technologies, the body enters the picture. So the point of secure flight is to verify identity, to substantiate with evidence, to make true, to link the traveler with their identity documents. In contrast, the stated purpose of body scanning, or if you don't want to go through the scanner, you get an enhanced genital pat-down, for those of you who don't walk through it, is to identify potential threats to the airplane and its passengers. So those threats are hidden on the body. Terrorists, the Department of Homeland Security explains, will employ novel methods to artfully conceal suicide devices. Of course, when many transgender travelers are scanned and patted down, TSA agents are seeing in the image or feeling in the pat-downs things they didn't expect to be there. Male genitalia on female travelers, breasts on male travelers. They are also not seeing or feeling things they do expect to be there. Men are missing penises, women lack developed breasts, and so a category crisis ensues. Ben Singer calls this moment of crisis the transgender sublime and explains that the sheer variety of trans bodies and genders exceeds the agent's cognitive capacity to comprehend them. So he talks about this in relation to medical providers. He tells a story of one resident who is just fixing up people all the time, sewing people up, fixing broken arms. A trans woman comes in with a broken arm. He's like, I don't know how to fix your arm. Everything he knows about medicine leaves his head. The whole body imaging program was not put in place to verify identity, yet for many transgender travelers, the image of the body became the site, to paraphrase Professor Fansin, of gender verediction, a place where truth is sought, but in many cases not found. Travelers whose bodies, identity documents, and presentations fail to align as expected present the TSA with a difficult choice. One can imagine a TSA agent thinking, is the gender what the document says it is, what the traveler declares it to be? This body is not telling me. There is some threat here. So the epistemic uncertainty arises from the collision of different sets of rules for classifying gender. A letter written to the head of the TSA by 3 trans advocacy groups describes what has happened in some of these situations. They document a case in which a male transgender attorney was detained for 2 hours on his way to an out-of-town court hearing by TSA agents because his intimate anatomy, as indicated by a whole body image scan and subsequent pat-down, did not conform to the agent's expectations. During his detention, he was subjected to humiliating personal questions and comments about the history of his body and his identity. In addition, a bomb appraisal unit was called in to evaluate him as a potential threat. Eventually, he was allowed to get on a later flight, but he was advised to carry a physician's letter regarding his transgender status whenever he flies. For trans travelers, these unfortunately are not isolated events. In fact, when I mentioned this paper to a friend on the phone the other day, he said, oh yeah, that happened to me. I spent 2 hours in a little room because of a gonadal anomaly in my body scan. They had to investigate because I was a potential threat before he could board. So, in describing the anomalies and uncertainties that emerge as a result of the securitization of gender, we're not trying to suggest that these particular airport events, however distressing to the traveler, are not comparable to the injustices done to peoples and individuals and bodies in the name of national security. Though, of course, in other contexts, gender misclassification can certainly have very material consequences. Just one study, a recent study in California, found that for transgender women in jail, they were 13 times more likely to experience sexual assault than non-transgender than their peers in jail. We do, however, think there's something to be learned by looking at how the apparently more mundane, minor, meticulous, and detailed work of these regulatory apparatuses sits with the heightened scrutiny of actual bodies. We haven't sorted out all the implications of this problem we've described above, but we do have some ideas, and now in the concluding section of this paper, I'll just briefly describe a few of them. So first, papers and bodies, or sovereignty versus governmentality, biopolitics, societies of control. Most agencies have chosen one system for classifying gender. birth sex or reassigned sex, gender identity or body configuration. But the airport becomes a place where some transgender people end up in the purgatory of gender uncertainty because one agency, the TSA, effectively relies on at least two different metrics, identity documents and bodies. So in working on this paper, it has been very hard to resist the temptation to see the different TSA policies as reflecting a tension between sovereign forms of power and governmentality, biopolitics, and societies of control, between bodies and papers, between individuals and populations, between police as in the uniformed people and police as in police powers. We were also tempted to suggest that these different forms of power produce different systems for classifying gender. And so this actually is a bit of debate between me and my co-author. And I'm the one, I study gender binaries all the time, and so everywhere I see a binary in attention. And she's like, maybe we don't need to just put them in opposition. And she's probably right. So we don't think it would be productive to sort things out quite so neatly by engaging in a new iteration of what Valverde and Rose referred to as the jury debate about sovereign power versus discipline. Second, actually I'm going to skip this, but it was just about moving from probability to possibility. I'm going to just go to the last point I want people to think about. And finally, thinking about gender as part of the link between the state and the citizen's body. For Fichte, ensuring that each citizen shall be at all times and places recognized as this or that particular person constitutes the chief principle of a well-regulated police state. Many have troubled over the best way to cement the link between the citizen and the state, or the inhabitant and the state, and many have thought it to be an ultimately impossible project. But gender as a biometric identifier has been for a very long time one of the vital facts included in the state's inventory of what must be contained in an accurate description, something the state can count on to help establish a link between the person and the paper. In thinking through how gender is used to link citizens to the state, however, we want to rethink the question's premises. The question assumes that there's one state and that there is, or could be, one uniform system of gender classification. As I explained in the book I'm working on, The United States of Gender, an individual's legal sex can change depending on a number of circumstances. So when some individuals cross borders, walk into a government office to apply for benefits, get a driver's license, go to prison, sign up for selective service, try to get married, apply for a passport, or have any interaction with any arm of the state, the legal sex of some people can and often does switch from male to female or female to male. To complicate matters even more, almost every state agency, from federal to municipal, has the regulatory authority to decide their own rules for sex classification. So my argument in the book, based on looking at case law, policy, regulations, and informal rules, is that a transgender individual's legal sex can change depending on what a particular state actor is trying to accomplish. So, for example, trans people can often get state-issued identity documents listing their reassigned gender, but courts in many jurisdictions have found that sex is fixed at birth for the purposes of marriage. So these are not so much perplexing contradictions, however, as expressions of different state projects, one centered on recognition, the other on distribution, one enunciated in the register of the state and the spatial logics of control, the other the language of nation, narrative, property, and temporality. So what seem to be contradictions in gender definition in the U.S., across jurisdictions, between agencies, and at different times, are simply the consequences of the fact that the state is not a singular entity but multiple, and does not do one thing but many. What makes this hard to fathom, as Timothy Mitchell has suggested in an important critique of political science literature on the state, is that while in actuality states are messy, diffuse, ambiguous, the public imaginary of the state as an ideological construct is much more coherent. And gender, while it is imagined as a tactile and visual thing, easily divided into a binary formation, is just as messy and diffuse a concept as the state is. So if the only thing we know for sure about gender is what a state actor says it is in any particular instance, and that's kind of the operating premise of trying to think through some of this stuff, if the state is not unitary, coordinated, and hierarchically organized in some kind of totalizingly rational way, or if, as Foucault suggests, the state is better described as a mobile effect of regimes of multiple governmentalities, then it should come as no surprise that the state definitions of gender are also plural. So in trying to understand contradictory systems of gender classification backed by the force of law, it's not what gender is that we should focus on and argue about, but what gender does. Thank you very much.